The sun. For millions of years, the source of life. But for one planet, the source of its demise. The temperatures climbed. The vast fields of ice at its poles melted, and the oceans rose. Centuries later, few people remain on this planet once called Earth.
Climate change attacks the overall resiliency of human society by increasing the frequency, duration, and intensity of extreme weather and environmental events for populations generally below the 45th parallel. By now, you're probably used to hearing about the climate change crisis and its effects on the Arctic region, that the Arctic is disappearing. But the situation is actually far more concerning at the southern pole. Many in the public and private sector and research industries are acutely aware of this issue. And all things considered, less attention is given towards the potential solutions. Perhaps this is because fear is a stronger theme in media. And the media perceives these solutions as less interesting. In my view, human ingenuity can be a far more terrifying force than climate change, if left unobserved and unaccountable.
Global warming is the season. Mankind is the virus. We're making our planet sick. A cold is our only hope.
So let's talk a little about those solutions. Most solutions fall into two different categories. Let me start with the more familiar first. The first is more transparent and more accountable. It's basically just a mitigation or management strategy, which usually involves governmental, political, tax-based solutions. And essentially there are three parts composing these. First is better distribution of remaining resources to reduce conflict and increase cooperation. 2. Pigouvian methods to disincentivize further climate and environmental damage. And 3. A conservative or defensive approach to risk planning in light of projected extreme weather events. So this strategy is fairly common these days, but two things to keep in mind is it moves a lot slower and it's very vulnerable to cooperative sentiment and issues with political bargaining. So the second category includes adaptation strategies, which go beyond mitigation and attempt to counter or reverse the costs of increasing scarcity and climate change via technological solutions like geoengineering, most of which are high risk. And this is a newer field and far more decentralized. It's a wild west of ideas, companies, and even public projects. Though not cooperating, almost all are fighting against scarcity and disaster itself. In this video, I want to start with one of the more docile forms of geoengineering, the Iceberg Cowboys of the Middle East. Unsurprisingly, many of the most water-stressed countries are in the Middle East and North Africa, and these trends will only worsen in the coming decades. The UAE is forecasted to be one of the most water-stressed countries in the world. It currently receives less than 4 inches of rainfall per year, and this is further challenged by the rising consumption rates due to high levels of economic development. All available natural water resources could be exhausted within the coming decades. The costs of ignoring this challenge cannot be understated. Water is the most critical resource to any society. It underpins all health security. The UAE will not exist without it. Steps to reduce water consumption and better manage water resources are already underway. However, the severity of the issue has incentivized increasingly creative solutions, often from researchers or the private sector. In the UAE, a consultancy called the National Advisor Bureau has revisited an old idea to tow icebergs from the poles to create new sources of fresh water. These million-ton icebergs from Antarctica could contain enough fresh water to supply 1 million people over 5 years. After lassoing a net around the iceberg, it will be towed approximately 9,000 kilometers across a 1-year journey. The iceberg would then settle 25 kilometers off a coastal region and be harvested by ice crushing machines and processed in a nearby plant. This idea has a bit of a history. In the mid-1800s, very small icebergs were towed to Chile for use in breweries. Oceanographer John Isaacs considered iceberg towing as less energy intensive than desalination. Rand Corporation thought floating nuclear power stations could power propellers attached to icebergs for transit. A Saudi Arabian prince considered a similar idea in 1977. However, the idea is only really seen practice in Canada, where the oil and gas industry tows 100,000-ton icebergs a few kilometers away from their offshore platforms to prevent collisions. Alexei Marchenko, a professor in ice mechanics, argues that the nets and steel wires used by these companies to lasso smaller icebergs may not work on the larger icebergs needed to supply fresh water for the UAE. When 100,000-ton icebergs are only 60 to 80 meters wide at the waterline, which is small by Antarctic standards. 1 million-ton icebergs are the more likely target for the UAE. They would need synthetic fiber ropes and nets to lasso the iceberg for transit and to prevent it primarily from rolling over, alongside insulating material to slow its melt rate. The cost of this material, especially when used on an iceberg several kilometers long, would be pretty pricey. Grant Brigg, an Earth Systems professor, identifies several other technical and financial challenges. First, a sufficiently strong vessel to tow the iceberg could be unfeasible. As a result, the National Iceberg Bureau would need several iceberg towing vessels, which would all run about $75,000 per day per vessel. The full trip would probably take a year, keep in mind. Second, the risk of breakup and melting during the journey, and particularly the maintenance needed to maintain iceberg integrity while it travels through the rough conditions in the Southern Ocean, would be challenging. Simulations place losses at 38% per 5 months of transportation, even in favorable conditions. Either way, stopping for repairs, avoiding weather systems, and attempting to avoid polar currents, whenever possible, would all be necessary. The National Advisor Bureau hopes to avoid some of these weather and current-related conditions by harvesting from an island 1,000 kilometers north of Antarctica for transport to Fujairah. Based on internal simulations and accompanying investor backing, they claim that the technical and financial roadblocks are clear, so the project will begin as soon as possible. Outside consultants have estimated a price tag of around $500 million for this particular project, but Abdullah Muhammad Al-Shehi, who heads the Emirates Iceberg project at the NAB, wants more than just fresh water. A large enough iceberg would create a microclimate, in his view, increasing nearby rainfall frequency and returning the nearby Fujairah to its formerly green state. In addition, as a tourist destination and a source of natural ice for the food and beverage industry, the return on investment is more justified than it would appear at first. However, there are risks. The microclimate outcome is notable because scientists are unsure if it would harm the current marine ecosystem or improve the marine ecosystem. And in the same hand, they don't know if it would promote new ecosystems on land at all. The freshwater melt from the iceberg would settle at the top of the sea, but temperature drop would likely change the underwater ecosystem and behavior of marine life. However, iceberg melt also leaks nutrients into the ocean, promoting growth for plankton and attracting small fish and seabirds as a result. Increased rainfall, cloud cover, and vegetation growth near the coast would build a new biome as cold air from the iceberg interacts with hot air in the region. So meteorologists think it could result in cloud development in areas around the icebergs. They're unsure how it could impact larger scale weather patterns involving rainfall levels over the coast or the desert as a whole. But it is worth noting that this geoengineering project could interact with other projects, like the coastal desalination, which is a major part of the UAE's freshwater portfolio. Because the desalination plants add additional briny water into the nearby seas, the freshwater melt from the icebergs could help counteract this water. Either way, the key political takeaway is this: Antarctica itself is subject to global treaties that mandate environmental regulations, so a positive environmental impact will need to be proven to justify this project or future projects in the long run. There is a non-trivial risk of the iceberg flipping over as it breaks down, creating a tsunami event near coasts, which has the added hazardous effect of causing greater damage to nearby populations that were propped up by tourism in the first place. Al-Shehi argues that it's a green strategy to utilize fresh water from icebergs that were already going to melt anyway, and thus go to waste if they melt at the southern poles, far from major populations. And very rough estimates place Antarctic freshwater potential at 70% of the Earth's total, so why let that go to waste? Well, the difference is in the details. We're not exactly sure what would happen if icebergs are removed in large quantities from the southern poles, and they could have unintended second-order effects on glaciers propped up on Antarctic land, such as it could result in them heating faster, or changes in currents or weather systems, and these effects could facilitate even faster sea level rise or freshwater loss. Key thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the cryosphere is that sea level rise occurs when icebergs break off glaciers and fall into the ocean, not necessarily when icebergs melt. So in other words, glaciers are more permanent fixtures, they're ice on land. If the glaciers melt, then the sea level rises. And if the glaciers break and form icebergs which crash into the ocean, the sea level rises. In reality, these unknown unknowns would really only become an issue if iceberg lassoing became a rampant and runaway trend. Despite these risks and unknowns, we shouldn't underestimate the UAE's interest in grandiosity, tourism, and cutting-edge ingenuity, especially when faced with the following threats. In the decades to come, if its freshwater needs are not met, it will have to rely on water imports with hefty price tags that would strain budgets and draw from social services and welfare projects. The reliability of these imports would be unknown, especially if the nation that they depend on turned off the tap to save itself during a drought, which is a very likely scenario in the coming decades. Historically speaking, nations have a preference to avoid these kinds of vulnerabilities, which they assume would be exploited in the world of power politics. Climate change creates more vulnerabilities for these countries, incentivizing risk-taking behavior in those that are especially hit hard. And other low-risk technological solutions like desalination are still too energy-intensive. They pollute anyway, and the costs of transport to areas further inland are high and will likely remain high until new forms of transportation are invented. Perhaps the same could be said for the iceberg projects. It's unlikely that sea transit will ever be energy neutral or non-pollutive without utilizing renewable energy. But the UAE is far from alone in Antarctic interest. The idea of utilizing or manipulating the Antarctic has seen growing interest in the scientific community. The cryosphere could be the main arena within which we fight climate change. Some scientists now consider them a very high leverage point, a key fulcrum in slowing down or speeding up climate change. A team of other scientists have a plan to save the West Arctic ice shelf, which is the most vulnerable region to melt right now. By constructing vast berms under vulnerable icebergs, they hope to artificially prop them up and cut off the flow of warm water that facilitates further melt. Basically, this effort would delay the rate at which glaciers melt and transition into icebergs, which therefore delays the rate of sea level rise and planetary warming. They hope that this could even buy time for the glaciers to regrow, and recent simulations suggest that utilizing these berms and the methods described could control or prevent the flow of warm water from melt. Either way, it's evident that manipulating the cryosphere will be a likely strategy into the future in some way or form. And while the berm method works in scenarios, the cost to build these berms is challenging enough, a familiar issue. The Antarctic will continue to melt in the meantime and present opportunities for iceberg cowboys from parched countries to conserve these freshwater resources before they are lost. But the UAE is just one of many nations or cities in the Middle East and North Africa that could benefit from this method. In fact, the entirety of the Indo-Pacific could be viable, including East Africa. In theory, icebergs that are far enough removed from glaciers could be moved from the western shelf and taken to a place like Perth in Australia, and then redistributed across the Indo-Pacific to areas in need or to the buyer's destination. Coastal cities and regions with severe and continued water stress include Mumbai, Karachi, Mogadishu, Jeddah, Doha, Aden, and many others. Even cities in Central and South America could also be viable due to their closeness to the west shelf of Antarctica. Heard Island, the current island of interest and owned by Australia, might have enough fresh water for 10 or 15 million people over 5 years. It's got a very rough estimate of 6 square kilometers of icebergs, but of course only a small fraction of that would be viable for lassoing and transport. Bouvet Island is another one, which is closer to South Africa and owned by Norway. Those icebergs could be sold to Cape Town with a relatively short transit journey of 2.6 thousand kilometers. Transportation costs would still probably be in the hundreds of millions. However, in all cases, cost is still a problem, and more innovative forms of transportation would likely be necessary. The ocean is increasingly well-traveled by tens of thousands of ships at any given moment, and the vast majority of these follow routes in the ocean, often referred to as the sea lanes or sea lines of communication. In theory, these ocean lanes, or highways, could be developed similar to our roads on land. Obviously today there are no gas stations or rest stops or convenience stores on the ocean, and if there were, they would look pretty different. But this lack of permanent fixtures at sea is changing. The US Navy wants to build a permanent undersea network of semi-autonomous vehicles, and deep-sea floating wind farms are already in the works. Maybe Rand Corporation was on to something, recommending to use propellers attached to icebergs and renewable energy to power its movement. Perhaps a semi-autonomous ocean conveyor system driven by floating wind power gas stations, semi-autonomous towing or propelling, and maintenance vehicles, and the ocean's natural current systems could make the trip more cost-friendly and eco-friendly. But to bring things back into reality, cryosphere interaction is a net plus either way, since it is a high leverage point. Improving the tech, financial interest, and social awareness around this area is a win-win no matter what. And to be honest, this is one of the more docile and viable geoengineering projects, mainly because it focuses on the cryosphere instead of the atmosphere. But it is important to shed light on these efforts and hold these groups accountable.
Citizens of the good ship, I've had a vision.
Yeah, well, we're tired of your visions. What about the land you promised us?
Geoengineering sits on a vast spectrum, and as we will see in future videos, the dark end of that spectrum has technologies almost indistinguishable from chemical weapons. To greatly paraphrase Thomas Kuhn, science creates worlds, and geoengineering is probably the clearest example of that. We just have to make sure that we're creating the right worlds.
On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations.